Maureen became a member of the Labour Party in 1956. So by the time she died in February 2021, she'd been a member of the Labour Party for 65 years. She was on Shurham Council from 1964, was a parliamentary candidate for Tunbridge Wells in 1970, and was on West Sussex County Council from 1971 to 74. She then became Labour MP for the newly created Northampton North in 1974, and was in the House of Commons from 74 to 79 when she lost her seat in the general election. Maureen was an amazing stepmother to myself and my sister, and we became very close to her own children, who were a bit older and so had already left home, and still are. She treated us as her own from the very beginning, organising camping trips, holidays, and generally being a mother to us as we completed our education and I started at medical school. She was also working extremely hard. She was a completely dedicated constituency MP, and she was always travelling up and down to Northampton. Nothing was more important to her than her constituents, and it didn't matter what their own politics were. She saw it as her job to do her very best for each and every one of them, and would not tolerate unfairness or injustice in any form. Her work in Parliament is better covered by the politicians, but it included campaigning for a woman's right to choose, the rights of prostitutes, and nuclear disarmament. She was a long-standing member of CND. She tried to introduce creche facilities to the House of Commons to allow more women to be able to work in Parliament, and she was a treasurer of the Tribune group. When Nigel Dunster of the Daily Mail published an expose of the relationship between them, it was very hard. Support from Maureen within the PLP and locally in Northampton was patchy, to say the least. Throughout this terrible time, Maureen remained courageous and dignified, and refused to apologise for her love for my mother. Maureen and my mother were together for 45 years. They married in 2015 at the ages of 85 and 82, respectively, until my mother died in February 2020, followed by Maureen just under a year later. Maureen lost her seat in the House of Commons in 1979 with the advent of the Thatcher government. She was, as always, an optimist and proud that she had lost by less than the national swing. Less than the national swing is in quote marks there. She went on to continue her political work outside the House. She worked for Gingerbread, an organisation which supported single-parent families, and wrote her book, A Woman in the House. She became a Hackney councillor and served on Hackney Council from 1982 to 1990. Maureen and Babs moved to Ambleside in Cumbria in 1992, and soon after moving, Maureen set up North West Government Relations, a lobbying educational group. She was in the Lake District National Park Authority from 1998 to 2006, and was on the Lakes Parish Council. In 2017, Maureen received a letter from Dale Willis, then chair of Northampton Labour Party, apologising. She sent it to me with this note: "Dearest Maymay and Kay, you can imagine my surprise after all the heartbreak, but it's undeniably here, and I'm happy. Much love, Maureen." There we go.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Is there anyone here that was a member of the Labour Party in 1974, 79? Thank you, Ross. I know there will be at least one person. Oh, thank you. I wasn't. Just like many of us. Were you here? No, just like me. I'll call on signing up please to introduce to us our guest speaker.
It's fantastic to see so many people here to honour Maureen, because as Lucy read out, she wasn't well treated at the time by the public, by the press, and, as we said, by the Labour Party. And although we sent her a letter of appreciation, this is actually the first time that she's ever been publicly honoured in this country for what she did, which is quite remarkable considering, and you'll hear Angela describe everything that she went through. So this is really an event of national importance because she was the first person to come out in Parliament, and it was a couple of decades before anyone else dared to do it. You know, she was a real trailblazer. And it's also great because it's LGBT plus History Month, so it's the right event at the right time. So it's actually a great shame that the Conservative Council tried to stop the meeting because they didn't approve of having a Labour Party meeting in here. But this, it seems to me, is a huge significance that goes way beyond the Labour Party. They did say then that we could have the meeting, but we won't broadcast it or tweet it. So for the avoidance of doubt, the hashtags are Maureen Colquhoun, and LGBT plus HM, LGBT plus History Month. So, without more ado, I want to welcome very much Angela Eagle for coming to give this first memorial lecture. Angela came out herself in 1997, wasn't it? So, and at the time, it was an incredibly brave and courageous thing to do, and a real inspiration. And it's great also to have here today Maria Etzel, who is Angela's partner and is the president of the TUC. It's fantastic that you're here with us today. Thank you very much for coming, Maria. Angela has been a force in the Labour Party, both in government and actually out of government as well, in opposition. And I've known her since we were members of the Labour Party together in Peckham, and she has always been the same. She has always campaigned, she's always stood on her principles, she's always been very brave, she's always crossed the street to have a fight with somebody who was on the wrong side of history. She has been absolutely relentless in her pursuit of her principles and of seeing society changed for the better. And she has been in senior roles in the Labour Party, senior roles in government, and I'm sure will be in senior roles, because you've just been reselected, when Labour comes back into government, and she'll be joined on the Labour side by Lucy as well, which will be fantastic. Angela, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Big round of applause, please, for Angela.
Well, thank you very much, Sally. I'm hoping everyone can hear me because I've just been wired up to the wires. Hopefully they're properly earthed. It gives me great pleasure to give this inaugural Maureen Colquhoun Memorial Lecture today, and I intend to use it to reflect on the trailblazing work of a genuine political pioneer who left a legacy any MP ought to be proud of. Not enough, I don't think, is known about her today, and I believe strongly that this should change, so I really thank all of you in her local Labour Party for organising this event, which I know is going to go up on YouTube, and I hope that more people will be able to learn about Maureen's fantastic contribution to the battle for equality for women and LGBT people in our country. She packed an awful lot into the 6 incident-filled years, 5 years, she served in the House of Commons. She represented the constituency of Northampton North between February 1974 and May 1979, and in that short time, she fought 3 general elections, had 2 vicious internal reselection battles to be allowed to stand again as the Labour candidate, and perhaps it It might seem surprising that a left-leaning member of the Tribune group should be treated this way by her constituency Labour Party, but she was, and I intend to discuss why later in my remarks. Maureen was a trailblazing feminist and a campaigner for women's rights, who was as fearless as she was eloquent. She took up important, often unpopular causes in Parliament, which was then virtually devoid of women MPs at all. Her work was a key part of the battle for women's liberation, which was raging outside of the House of Commons in 1970s Britain. She was, I think, almost naive in her pursuit of progressive reform, regardless of the consequences that it might have for her reputation, as a vindictive and male chauvinistic press circled her. But more of that later. She was an LGBT plus pioneer whose achievements certainly ought to ensure her place as an icon of the LGBT plus rights movement in this country. She was the first, as we heard, the first openly LGBT plus MP in Parliament's long history, after being outed as a lesbian by the odious Daily Mail gossip columnist Nigel Dempster in April 1976. To put this in its proper historical context, this was 8 years before Chris Smith became the first openly gay man to serve in the House of Commons, when he outed himself in 1984. And it was 21 years later that I came out as a lesbian, only the second woman ever to do so. By force of logic, you will have worked out that Maureen was the first. And it was to be 10 more years before other out lesbians were to join me on the green benches in the House of Commons. So coming out this way may seem like no big deal in 2023, when our UK Parliament has only just surrendered the title of the gayest parliament in the world to the much smaller New Zealand equivalent in Wellington. But it really was a very big deal indeed back then. Declaring openly one's sexual orientation as a serving member of Parliament had never happened before, when Maureen was cruelly outed by the Daily Mail. She was the first ever to find herself exposed in this way to the press feeding frenzy which resulted. What happened to her, especially the savage and bigoted treatment she received, stood as a warning to others, deliberately encouraging the closet door, I think, to remain firmly closed. And to a large extent it did remain closed for the next 20 years, until the backlash against the cruelties of Thatcher's Section 28 gathered pace and led to the politicisation of a beleaguered community which decided that it had to campaign for its rights, to be treated equally and not to be scapegoated and picked on in the law and in the media. Now, 1970s Britain was a very different country to the one we know now. And this is crucial context if we're to appreciate Maureen's pioneering work to its full extent. Britain had just gone through the swinging 60s, a time when the social and political assumptions which had dominated the socially conservative and repressive 1950s were torn up by a new generation of young people demanding liberation from that repressive era. The widespread availability of the pill had helped women free themselves from the fear of getting pregnant if they were sexually active outside marriage. Both the women's liberation and the gay liberation movements became established during this time, demanding reform and more individual freedom. The culture was changing rapidly, and progressive social reform was enacted by the then Labour government in response to these changing times. Huge progress was made in areas such as the virtual ending of capital punishment, allowing unmarried women access to contraception, the liberalisation of divorce law, the liberalisation of abortion law, and the complete ending of theatre censorship. Now, this consigned the absurd figure of the Lord Chamberlain and his red pencil censoring plays firmly to history where he belonged. The horrors of backstreet abortionists were also consigned to history, alongside the repressive laws which attempted to police women's bodies by denying them access to safe abortion services. The Sexual Offences Act, decriminalising homosexual acts between two consenting adults in private, was also passed by this reforming Labour administration in 1967, a mere 9 years before Maureen was outed. The 1967 Act finally ended the criminalisation of all homosexual activity, which had first been introduced by Henry Labouchere in what became Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885. Now, one of those remarkable coincidences which history sometimes presents us with, Labouchere was one of Maureen's predecessors as MP for Northampton. Whilst he was regarded as a radical Liberal MP, he was a bigot when it came to homosexuality, and he successfully manufactured a chance to enact his prejudices into law. I don't know what's in the water in Northampton, but something must be. So it was his legislation which was used to convict Oscar Wilde, and which led to 82 years of savage repression and discrimination against gay men in the UK. Now, Labouchere's amendment had notoriously also originally included lesbians within its scope, but all reference to women was removed from the law when Queen Victoria questioned whether such acts could even be committed by women. But the Queen's lack of imagination did at least have benign consequences for lesbians who were able to escape the attention of the criminal law thereafter, unlike their unfortunate male counterparts. The 1970s were a decade of strife and political upheaval. 4 general elections, mass strikes, the 3-day week, economic turmoil, and the oil shock, which sent inflation soaring over 20%. It sounds familiar, but I'm told that history doesn't repeat itself. But all of these things formed the background to this turbulent decade. It was a politically unstable decade. It began and ended with Labour losing power to a Tory party invigorated by the ideology of market fundamentalism, intent on ending the post-war Butzkelite consensus. Yet it was Labour which was in government for 6 of these 10 years, and Maureen was at the centre of it all. Looking back on a decade I lived through as a teenager, it's easy to forget just how few of the women's rights we now take for granted were actually in place at this time. A look at some of the legislation passed in the 1970s, voted for by Maureen, will illustrate my point. The Equal Pay Act made it illegal for the first time to give women lower levels of pay or conditions of employment than men. It was still widely assumed that women should be the homemakers and men the breadwinners. If women did work, it was assumed that they did so to earn pin money to help pay for a few nice little extras. In the 1970s, legislation was finally passed which allowed women to apply for mortgages in their own right. I'll just say that again. Passed legislation that allowed women to apply for mortgages in their own right. Up until then, they'd had to rely on the signature of a male guarantor to take out a mortgage. In 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act made it illegal to discriminate against women in work, training, or education. All such discriminations had been legal up until the passage of this groundbreaking piece of legislation, steered through the Commons by Barbara Castle, one of my personal political heroines. Also in 1975, the Employment Protection Act made it illegal to sack women for being pregnant, established the right for pregnant women to take maternity leave, and guaranteed them their jobs back when that leave came to an end. Up until then, it had been expected, and sometimes even required in some professions, that women who married gave up their jobs to look after the home as soon as the wedding had happened. Any pregnant woman could simply be dismissed prior to the passage of this legislation. Now, women were not encouraged to socialise together. It took a court case in 1982, taken by lawyer Tess Gill and journalist Anna Coote, against the Elvino pub in Fleet Street, to establish the right for women to be served at the bar in a pub at all. This de facto ban had hitherto made it impossible for all female pub visits to take place without the presence of a man to buy the drinks. So there were certain ways in which 1970s Britain still resembled Gilead, the fundamentalist sexist dystopia which so memorably features in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Little wonder then that the National Women's Liberation Movement was set up in 1970 to campaign for the following demands: equal pay, equal education and job opportunities, free contraception and abortion on demand, free 24-hour nurseries, legal and financial independence for all women, and subsequently, albeit more controversially, the right to a self-defined sexuality, an end to discrimination against lesbians, and freedom of women from intimidation by the threat or use of violence or sexual coercion, regardless of marital status, and an end to the law's assumptions and institutions which perpetuate male dominance and aggression to women. So this then was what those dangerous women's lib, so-called bra burners, were after achieving during their high-profile campaigning in the 1970s. The press ridiculed them, but they were enthusiastically championed by Maureen in the House of Commons. And sisters contemplating that list of demands 50 years on, it's safe to say that we still have a little bit of work to do. There's one final bit of context, I think, which it's essential to bear in mind when considering the details of Maureen's career in the House of Commons during the 1970s. And that is the sheer dearth of women who managed to be elected to the House of Commons during this time. When Maureen was first elected in February 1974, the percentage of women elected had gone down from the 4.1% who'd been successful in 1970 to just 3.6% of all MPs. Now that is that there were 23 women out of 635 members of Parliament. There were 9 Tories, 1 SNP, and 13 Labour. And 3 of them were newly elected. That is Jo Richardson, Audrey Wise, and Maureen Colquhoun. After the October 1974 election, which slightly strengthened the Labour position, that percentage soared to 4.3. And that is 27 out of 635 MPs. 7 Tories, 2 SNP, and 18 Labour. The new Labour women elected in October included Elaine Hayman, who was to cause controversy by daring to breastfeed her young child in the House of Commons. Shock horror. And she later became the first female Lord Speaker. Margaret Jackson, née Beckett, who led the Labour Party after John Smith's untimely death, was the first female Foreign Secretary and Labour Deputy Leader and is still serving in the House today and sits with me on the National Executive Committee. Joan Maynard, a doughty left-winger who was known affectionately as Stalin's granny. She was an agricultural worker and was David Blunkett's predecessor in Sheffield Brightside. Millie Miller, MP for Ilford North, who had been the first woman to lead a London council but died suddenly in 1977. And Anne Taylor, who was the first woman ever to be appointed to any whip's office and went on to become the first ever female chief whip. She now serves in the House of Lords. In 1979, when the UK elected Margaret Thatcher, its first ever woman Prime Minister, the percentage of women went back down to 3%, or 19 out of 635. This did not include Maureen, who was defeated, as we've heard earlier, in Northampton North in that general election. Now the House has changed in many ways since these times, not least because it now boasts 220 women, the highest number ever elected, and it will be joined by Lucy in due course. But that still only comprises 34% of the total of 650 MPs. And although over 50% of the Parliamentary Labour Party is currently female, perhaps that's not the triumph it seems, as we currently have the smallest Parliamentary Labour Party since 1935, following the disastrous Brexit election of 2019. So the sheer lack of women had consequences, and Maureen mentions them in her autobiographical memoir, A Woman in the House. She complains that women were hardly ever called to speak in the serious economic debates, and expresses her frustration at sitting for hours in the Commons chamber and never being called to speak about economics because this was not considered a woman's topic. Maureen was, of course, more than qualified to speak on such subjects. As we heard earlier, she'd studied for an economics degree at the LSE. And she was even more outraged and made a point of order when, after an hour of debate on the Sex Equalities Bill in 1975, no woman had been called to speak. When she finally did get the chance, she pointed out that it made no sense to refer to he throughout the entire statute when it was explicitly about women, as she challenged the discriminatory and exclusionary language used throughout the legislation. She learned, though by experience, that upsetting the speaker was not a very good tactic when she was given a mere 4 minutes to make a speech after sitting in the debate waiting to be called for hours. Abandoning her notes, she spent 4 minutes complaining about the inequity of it all. She realised subsequently that she'd offended the speaker very much indeed, and she had plenty of opportunity to repent because she wasn't called again to speak for a very long time. So I have to say, Lucy, take note of this. Even after all the intervening years, the House is still like this. It's still best not to upset the Speaker, and backbenchers are increasingly expected to make their speeches in ludicrously short amounts of time, although it's not sensible to complain about it too much. As a Labour backbencher in what effectively became a minority government, Maureen was obliged with her colleagues to attend Parliament at all hours of the day and night to support the government's legislative programme. There were frequent late nights and all-night sittings. The result of votes were often on a knife edge, and it was not unusual to observe ill and even dying members of Parliament attending the House in ambulances to have their vote recorded because the Conservative opposition had been suspended pairing. The social reform the Labour government prioritised was progressive, as we've seen. And Maureen would have been happy to vote for all of these measures, although she did point out how weak and ineffectual they were likely to be and wished for them to be stronger. Nor was she content with the culture she found in the Commons or in the Parliamentary Labour Party. She was, as always, outspoken and opinionated about these things. The Daily Mail had not called her Maureen the Mouth when profiling her as a future MP for nothing. She'd also been referred to as the Chatterbox during her time on Shoreham District Council in the 1960s. Now, this was much less a reflection on her than an indication of how hard it was for a woman to be taken seriously at this time. Any woman who had the temerity to voice a strong opinion was likely to be landed with such a derogatory and disapproving name tag. And Maureen was throughout her political life never backward in coming forward with an opinion. She was used to having to operate in a hostile, sexist environment. She complained that if more than 3 women were seen walking or talking together in each other's company down a Commons corridor, that the men would get nervous and exclaim, "What's going on here? Here comes trouble." Some things are very slow to change in Parliament, because I can confirm that 20 years later, when I was newly in the Commons, as one of 60 out of 650 MPs, so still under 10%, the same thing happened if any of us were caught walking or talking together in the Commons corridors. We got so fed up with this happening that in the end we took to organising special Women's Week walkabouts just to feed the male paranoia. Now, when Maureen had walked into the Commons tea room on her first day in the job, she'd encountered her friend Arthur Blenkinson, who was the Labour MP for South Shields. He welcomed her and perhaps inadvisedly implored her to do something to improve the quality of the food. "You deal with the bloody food," she retorted. "I'm going to be Chancellor of the Exchequer." She was disappointed with what she regarded as the low level of feminist consciousness she encountered amongst the small but hardy bunch of Labour women in the parliamentary party. "I found no feminist MPs," she stated in her memoir, and she wryly observed that the Labour women did not seem willing to dismantle the patriarchal society because many of them hadn't heard of it. She deplored the strong expectation, not least coming from the Speaker, that women were expected to deal with women's issues when they were just as anxious as any other MP to speak on a far wider range of topics. She proved this by using her maiden speech in March 1974 to highlight the impact of the three-day week on her constituents and emphasise the importance of tackling inflation and achieving equality for women in the pensions system. She quickly became a leading voice for women's rights in a parliament which, as we have seen, contained only a tiny minority of women MPs. She effectively acted as a bridge between the increasingly active and campaigning feminist movement outside the House and worked tirelessly to ensure that their concerns were reflected in at least some of the debates inside the House. In choosing which issues to highlight, Maureen was well ahead of her time and was a genuine feminist pioneer. She campaigned in June 1974, calling on her fellow women MPs to back her bid to make victims of rape anonymous, arguing that this would encourage more women to report rape, knowing that they could do so whilst their names were kept private. She also campaigned successfully to put a stop to the forced feeding of Irish prisoners on hunger strike, which she was horrified to discover was still going on. As we have seen, the restrictive abortion laws had been liberalised in 1967, but the 1970s saw a succession of attempts by anti-abortionists in the Commons to reverse this game, and Maureen was always in the forefront of the parliamentary effort to filibuster these private members' bills by talking them out. She certainly learned by doing when it came to the sometimes arcane procedures of the House. She complained bitterly that all the legislation being brought forward on abortion by backbenchers was seeking to water down the 1967 Act, which she thought should be liberalised further to give women the right to choose. She rightly pointed out that women were being subjected to laws made in the House by what she called the maleocracy, not a democracy, but a House of Commons containing only a very tiny number of women, and she labelled all such attempts as anti-women. She highlighted the many ways in which women were still being disadvantaged in British society in the legislation which she tried to get onto the statute book on her own initiative. She was lucky enough to be drawn in the ballot to propose a private member's bill, something which I've never achieved in 30 years of trying. Don't ask me to do the lottery for you. She decided to bring forward what she called the Balance of Sexes Bill, which, had it been successful, would have ensured equal representation for women on all government bodies and quangos. At this time, there were even fewer women on the boards of public bodies than there were in the House of Commons. The Daily Mail parliamentary sketch writer, observing the second reading debate of Maureen's bill, opined that she was, and I'm quoting, "one of the posse of stern and determined Labour ladies who always looked like they'd just come from reorganising Holloway and are shortly off to do the same for Parkhurst." Charming. She also used the 10-minute rule bill procedure to introduce a protection of prostitutes bill, which would have decriminalised prostitution and restored some civil rights to sex workers. Now, over 40 years later, it's sobering to relate that the reforms which both these bills would have introduced are still waiting to be legislated for. There's not been nearly enough progress for women in either of these areas. And it was while working on the campaign to support her Balance of the Sexes bill, as well as being briefed by outside campaigners on the sex discrimination bill, that Maureen first met Barbara Todd, the woman who was, as we heard, to become the love of her life. Todd was helping the women's rights campaign with parliamentary briefing, and she was also co-editor of the lesbian magazine Sappho. Unbeknownst to her, Maureen was a subscriber. In her memoir, Maureen relates that At their first meeting, Todd later revealed to her that she thought Maureen was a typically poorly dressed Labour woman MP. This revelation understandably made Maureen very cross indeed, and she criticised Todd for absorbing chauvinistic press myths. After Maureen rejected the chance to be briefed jointly alongside Tory women on the sex discrimination bill as a waste of her time, the Women's Rights Campaign decided that Barbara had the tact to deal with briefing Maureen on her own, and the rest is history. The first outward sign that something had changed in Maureen's private life came when she requested that the Speaker in future refer to her as Ms. rather than Mrs. Colquhoun. In fact, she'd come out to her family, separated from her husband Keith, and moved in with Barbara and her 2 daughters. And the couple did this openly, although they did not announce the relationship to the press. It was the occasion of a joint housewarming and birthday party for Barbara in March 1976, which led to Maureen being outed by Nigel Dempster in his vicious Daily Mail column a month later. In her memoir, Maureen notes that one of the party guests had been blackmailed for information about the relationship. She says, and I'm quoting her, "There was never, not once, ever, any attempt to hide our relationship. And I've always sought to give us status as a couple, for I believed it to be, as I do all gay relationships, as valid and entitled to respect as any other relationship." The gossip columnist gleefully reported the new arrangement and made sure he included the name of Todd's children and the street that they were living in for good measure. This led to them being besieged by press photographers and journalists for days on end, and as predictably were Maureen's ex-husband and her 78-year-old mother, who was living alone in Shoreham at the time. Constantly ringing telephones and doorbells, street harassment by journalists and photographers, approaches to all relatives and workmates, hassling Barbara's children. All of this was justified as somehow in the public interest. When Maureen somewhat naively made a complaint to the Press Council about the invasion of her privacy, the Daily Mail argued that the revelations were in the public interest because she held very strong views and was not therefore quite a backbencher. Dempster himself opined that if she couldn't stand the heat, she shouldn't come into the kitchen. He further declaimed what might be regarded as the gossip columnist's eternal mantra, that when a person enters public life, he, forfeits his right to privacy. The Spectator decided that the public had a right to know about Maureen's private life because a speech in favour of women's liberation has quite different validity if one knows it's delivered by a practising lesbian. The Daily Mirror criticised her for not being open about her sexual orientation, saying MPs whose sex life is not normal have always concealed the fact. It went on to argue a case that could never have been proved either way, that had she been open, it's unlikely she would have been adopted as the Labour candidate and elected to Parliament in the first place. Maureen was later to acknowledge that she'd been an idiot to trust the objectivity of the Press Council, which duly found against the right to privacy for her, and by implication for all of those in public life, except perhaps the editors of the newspapers. This led to much gloating pleasure from the Daily Mail, which now openly claimed that its revelations had been in the public interest, and it was a sense of public duty which had made the newspaper out her in the first place. But the Press Council also found that the privacy of Barbara Todd and Maureen's ex-husband, Keith Colquhoun, had been invaded, and that this had constituted harassment of a serious kind. It was just that they did nothing about it. It was the press, therefore, was allowed to act with impunity, and this has continued to be the case ever since. Maureen was to conclude correctly that I was a feminist, a lesbian, and a left-wing MP, fair game for the Daily Mail. Now, when I was considering whether to come out 22 years later, Maureen's appalling experience weighed heavily on my mind. In the end, I decided that being out was so important that I would have to take the risk that it would end my parliamentary career. Journalist Linda McDougall later asked Maureen what her advice to me would have been had I asked her for it. and Maureen's response was unequivocal. Her advice would have been, don't do it. Following all this controversy, Maureen quickly had to turn her attention to the constituency, where the furore had led to a serious attempt to get her deselected as the Labour candidate for the forthcoming general election. Maureen's memoir contains a great many details about the trials and tribulations she experienced in fighting to prevent her deselection, which have many a familiar ring to all of us who've been threatened with the same fate over the years. She describes the 2-year-long battle she had to prevent her sacking as the Labour candidate for Northampton North as living a nightmarish, almost twilight existence. She was later to observe that she'd never been involved in such savage politics before, and that she fervently hoped she never would again. She said that the real miracle of Northampton North and the selection battle was that her opponents didn't win, as they had a stranglehold on all the positions of influence. Her enemies included the chair, the secretary, 2 vice chairs, the treasurer of the CLP. An appreciation of internal Labour Party procedures, and of course many of us in this room will have that, and the nuances of the Labour Party rulebook is a must if one wishes to follow the ins and outs of the internal battles which ensued in detail. Suffice it to say that the moves began in secret in 1977, when a motion was taken from the floor of the largest ward in Northampton North to get rid of her. No proper notice had been given that this was to be considered, and only 11 people were at the meeting. The fact that this motion even existed, let alone had been carried, was not drawn to Maureen's attention until the last possible moment, either by the chair or the secretary, even though they were in regular contact with her. More information about what was going on was gleaned by her supporters from the local Tories than she was officially told by constituency party officers. The local and national press were also kept more in the loop than she was. Her local Labour opponents were being liberally quoted in the press reports, even though they hadn't had the courtesy to talk to Maureen themselves. The chair of the party opined to the press that she was elected as a working wife and mother. This business has blackened her name irredeemably. She was accused of being obsessed with trivialities such as women's rights. I'll just read that again. She was accused of being obsessed with trivialities such as the rights of 51% of the population, and not spending enough time in the constituency. That's an old one that many of us have heard. And the charges against her were expanded to include dissatisfaction about surgery attendances and responding to constituents' letters, thus wrongly implying that she was not doing her job. But these are all charges she refuted with easily available facts, saying that after 30 years in the Labour movement, she did not propose to have her integrity damaged by a lot of hot-headed rumour mongers. In her memoir, Maureen refers to the real reason, and I'm quoting her. Obviously, I'd heard the prejudiced remarks and the bigotry in the existence of anti-queer jokes among my party councillors and opponents. Northampton is a small town. Many of my voters came to tell me what was being said by councillors in the pubs and the clubs where they drank. She was initially deselected in September 1977 by 23 votes to 18, after which she declared that I'm gay and proud of it, and I'm glad that in my private life I have love and care for someone. Journalist Polly Toynbee, a Maureen supporter, concluded that I find it impossible to believe that they would have removed Maureen Colquhoun had she still been quietly married. And it's hard to disagree with that conclusion. Maureen immediately appealed to the National Executive Committee about the flawed nature of the process, and the NEC agreed with her, overturning the decision. Undeterred, the local party merely began proceedings to deselect her again, and with some insight now into how to do it properly by the rules. But then, as Maureen observes in her memoir, and again I'm quoting her, something happened in the Northampton Labour Party and I smelt victory over my opponents for the first time. The District Labour Party overreached itself and began to try to deselect all the local councillors as well as trying to destroy her. And I'm quoting her again, a feeling was in the air that Northampton Labour Party must be saved from the workers' fight caucus, open brackets or trots, call them what you will, this is what she said, which had infiltrated the party. She also points out that she thought that there was a Catholic dislike of her amongst some local party members too. She goes on to say, though, that this infiltration of workers' fight was a component of the group which had deselected her originally and were trying to do so again. She saw her opportunity, given that they'd overreached themselves. She fought back and won, this time by 26 votes to 17 in March 1979, just ahead of the general election. Her re-selection battles had consumed the final 2 years of her time in Parliament, and she'd fought, though, and she'd defended her reputation, and she'd won. But the triumph was double-edged, since her implacable opponents were still in positions of influence in the constituency party. They refused to use local funds to finance the general election campaign in 1979, telling her that there was only £277 available for the purpose. They refused to provide her with an agent, and 4 local wards refused to let her use the committee rooms they set up, as they did not approve of her being their candidate. Though she lost that general election, she felt that she had fought to protect her reputation and her honour, and she had. But Maureen, a left-wing progressive feminist, was replaced as the MP by Tony Marlowe, a right-wing conservative, who was to represent the seat until the wonderful Sally did the decent thing and took it back off him in 1997. In 2017, as we've heard, the Northampton North Labour Party sent Maureen a long letter of apology for the actions of their predecessors in hounding and attempting to deselect her. They acknowledged what we all now know and recognise, that Maureen was a trailblazer who played a pioneering role in fighting for women and LGBT+ rights at a time when it was not easy or popular to do so. She had deserved better treatment than she received at the hands of the local Labour Party, and all those years later, all of you and those that were responsible for sending that letter had accepted it. Maureen was the first out lesbian and the first out MP in Parliament's long history. For that alone, she should be remembered and celebrated. In Parliament, she was ridiculed, harassed and mocked for her principles and her commitment to advancing women's rights by chauvinists in the House and in the media. But she survived. She went on. She carried on campaigning. Some say that she was so far ahead of her time that it ruined her political career, and it is easy to make that argument. She was forthright, stubborn, principled, unbending, and she was as careless too, I think, of her own political safety, because she was so intent on the principles of what she was doing. Her connections with the wider social movements outside Parliament made her a unique bridge between the two. Her individualism made her unheeding of the political calculation which often features in the longest of political careers, and I say that as someone in my 31st year of a political career. By her sheer bravery and fortitude, she allowed others to glimpse a better future. She showed the way to a better future. And as I contemplate the LGBT+ movement for liberation as it now is, and think about the triumphs of the last Labour government's transformative equality agenda for LGBT people, we completed and ventured where she first led. And as I look at the confident assertion of many LGBT+ identities, especially amongst the younger generations, now living their lives more freely, more openly and more joyfully, I know that we have Maureen's pioneering example to thank for the progress. Her example showed us the way. She may not have had a long career in Parliament, but she had a career in Parliament that made more difference to the life we lead now than almost any others I can think of. Her efforts allowed those of us who came after her the chance to live openly in the better future that she pointed us to, and for that we should all remember and celebrate her. Thank you.
I probably don't need a microphone, is that right?
There's one on the...
I think I'm all right with that. All right with that?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Angela, thank you, because that was a really wonderful talk, a fittingly wonderful talk full of really, really fascinating detail. I'm sure you'll agree, detail about Maureen's life and about her views. And I'm sure each of us will have been struck by different things that Angela said, but the most striking thing for me was how you put her life and her views in context of a socially conservative period in which she was articulating some of these views that really made it so clear that she was a trailblazer. I think we can become glib about the progress that has been made in women's rights and LGBT rights, and everything Angela said, I think, very much encourages us not to be celebrating the achievements that Maureen made. I hadn't previously understood the extent to which she had been hounded by the Daily Mail, and actually the extent to which her family had been hounded as well. I can only imagine, I'm sure all of us can only imagine what that was like. And I was so struck, Angela, by what you said about her advice to you, actually, that she wouldn't do that again. That was, really incredible. The final thing that I'll say, and I think this came through really clearly for me, was everything that we've heard tonight so far about Maureen's qualities, not just as a politician, but as a human being, her bravery and her courage and her humanity, the strength of her love for her partner and for her family. And so please, another big round of applause for Angela. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. And we have a very welcome message of solidarity from the trade union movement as well, which has been really important in taking forward LGBT plus rights. So Lee Barron, Regional Secretary for the TUC, welcome.
If I just put that there, that'll probably pick things up. Can everybody hear me okay? So, yeah. Lovely, thanks everybody. And listen, it's great to be here. Thanks very much indeed for the invitation to be here. I've done a number of things and now with say in terms of the equality agenda, because I do believe quite passionately that the trade union movement brings something to the table that other movements frankly don't. I think that sometimes we need to look at ourselves in the mirror. I think there are times where we turn around as a movement and haven't been exactly at the forefront of what it is that we've been trying to do for the wider society. But I think once we get there, there's no place better than the trade union movement to allow people to be themselves, to, if you like, have that freedom and that space to turn around in safety and say, this is what I am, this is who I am. And I believe that the trade union movement brings that. And there's nobody better, I don't believe, in that than the TUC president who's here tonight, Maria Exel. Maria is the first LGBT plus president of the TUC, and I'm absolutely really proud of that. And what makes me even more proud is that she's a member, we're the member of the same union, the Communication Workers Union, and we kind of, if I can say it, grew up together within that union, albeit I was on the postal side and Maria was on the telecom side. And I can tell you now, if I'd have known she was coming tonight, I'd have given this slot up quite easily for her, but she turned around and said, no, don't do that, you do it. And I'll tell you why I'm pleased that she did that, because equality ain't a women's issue. Equality is our issue. We didn't leave apartheid to black South Africans to fight. We all came together and we did it together and we beat it. And that's what we've got to do. You know, today, the TUC in the Midlands has released a report that shows that women's wages are 16.5% less than men's wages today. That's fundamentally wrong. That's not a woman's issue. That's our issue. And we've got to come together in order to make sure that we can do something about that. And we've got to come together in order to make sure that the principles that we stand on as a movement of social justice, of solidarity and of equality, we do that together. We leave nobody behind. We make sure that as a movement we take people with us, and I'm absolutely proud to do that. The thing I like about this is we're celebrating Northampton and pioneers like that in Northampton that would have been seen at the time as a rebel, somebody we didn't support, somebody the party probably wanted to get rid of. Conviction politics, principled politicians are something that I fundamentally believe that we need, not because they become rebels, but because they become people that in years later we turn around and celebrate exactly what it was that they did for us. And what we need, I think, is a few more of them. And the people that we've had up here tonight, I mean, I was proud to be around here when Sally was the Member of Parliament. Certainly proud to see Angela. I don't know if you know, I've seen, the brilliant thing about Angela is that I've never seen anybody, I don't think, better than her. Opposite the Tories on the front bench, you know, going at them. I remember when he did Prime Minister's Questions a couple of 3 times, and there were some uncomfortable people on those Tory benches in relation to the way in which it was you dealt with them, because they couldn't get that. And I think that then that again comes from the authenticity that you've got, and I'm proud to have supported Lucy in her campaign as well. So we've got lots to do. I'm proud that the TUC in the Midlands can be part of it. And what I want to see is a bit more of this. You know, I've always had this saying within the Labour movement: the past we inherit, the future we build. And we've got to build that future ourselves. And we're on the cusp, I think, of something big in this country and something major in this country that can change this country for the better. And we've got to make sure that equalities are at the heart of that, and equalities, you know, mean something to people. Because the next general election will probably be the most divisive we've ever seen in our lifetime. Because they've got nothing fresh to say, people. They're going to talk about invasions, about boats, about everything else. We've got to talk about the future, about hope and what it means to people. And I'm sure that we can do that, and we'll deliver that better together as a united movement. Thanks very much.